Tonight we wander beneath a pale French moon, the kind that turns puddles to silver and makes the soft rippling feathers of geese shimmer like coins dropped in a fountain. You walk through a village where every sound carries, the wind in the poplars, the distant bark of a dog, and, most of all, the low, deliberate honking of a creature that apparently has more legal protection than you do. The air smells faintly of wet hay and something sharper, old feathers drying by a hearth. You're about to discover a truth no medieval traveler ever forgot. In certain corners of France, you could steal bread, borrow a cow, or even charm the miller's daughter, but heaven help you if you offended someone's goose. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The lane ahead bends toward a pond glinting in the dark. Geese shuffle there, white shapes moving in ghostly rhythm. You notice how a man with a lantern pauses before stepping closer. He mutters something, an apology, maybe, to the birds, as if asking permission to pass. Strange, you think, but then you catch sight of the carved post by the gate. A tiny wooden goose with painted eyes and a sign in Old French script warning travelers not to disturb the flock after curfew. Violate that decree, and the fine equals 3 days' labor, or worse, confiscation of your boots. The medieval French loved rules, especially when it came to property. And for reasons that historians still argue about, geese occupied a sacred gray zone between livestock and holy omen. They guarded, fertilized, alarmed, and even forecasted weather. A farmer's reputation could rise or fall with the condition of his geese. There's a record from the Dordogne, around 1273, describing a peasant who was fined because his birds honked too loudly during Sunday Mass. The offense? Blasphemous interruption of divine silence. Imagine being dragged before a village court because your goose had opinions during a sermon. The moon ducks behind a cloud as you pass the cottages. One window glows with candlelight. Inside, an old woman hums while plucking feathers into a neat pile, her feather tithe, due at the Lord's manor by sunrise. Every 10th handful must be counted, weighed, and wrapped in linen. The steward will inspect it, noting purity, length, and odor. Too damp? That's a penalty. Too short? Another. You begin to sense that these laws weren't only about control, they were about obsession. You pause near the well, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a door slams and a man swears softly. You catch the tail end of an argument, a villager accusing his neighbor of moon grazing, the illegal practice of letting geese roam after dusk. The logic behind it seems absurd, yet practical in its own way. Night grazing meant the birds might wander into another family's field, steal grain, or trample seedlings. So, the commune agreed, no honking past sundown. If the birds made noise, the owner paid the fine. Of course, geese don't read ordinances, and they honk when they please. One chronicler from Burgundy claimed that in 1312, a local bailiff hired a goose watcher to patrol after dark with a candle lantern and a long stick. His job? To hush the birds before they could incriminate their owners. The irony is perfect, a man enforcing silence on animals famous for their alarm calls. And according to a fringe record in the archives of Limoges, one particularly bold goose, nicknamed La Blanche, was said to have learned to mimic the sound of coins clinking, confusing tax collectors and causing such chaos that the magistrate declared her possessed. Historians still argue whether that goose ever existed, but the story refuses to die. The road dips toward a bridge of worn planks. Beneath it, frogs croak and water sighs over stones. You picture travelers crossing centuries ago, pilgrims, traders, or weary herders, each stepping carefully, mindful of the rules posted at every parish border. In one district, a goose could only cross if tagged with a wax seal showing its owner's crest. In another, herders needed permission slips stamped by 3 witnesses. Losing the paper meant losing the bird. Bureaucracy had already learned how to honk. A gust of wind stirs the reeds, and suddenly the pond erupts with sound, dozens of geese shrieking, flapping, splashing in alarm. You duck behind a tree as a boy runs out, barefoot, waving a lantern. He's muttering prayers, perhaps hoping the commotion won't attract the watchman. The air smells of mud and panic. And you realize something oddly tender. These villagers, hemmed in by impossible laws, loved their birds fiercely. They lived with them, argued about them, worshipped them in their way. The geese weren't merely livestock. They were noisy, unpredictable neighbors whose moods shaped the rhythm of rural life. From a nearby cottage, a rooster crows far too early. The boy groans. That counts as mourning. He complains to no one in particular, and now they'll fine me for the noise. You almost laugh, but stop yourself, he's right. In some towns, curfew lifted with the first crow, regardless of light. And so, his geese, technically honking after silence, had just broken the law. Somewhere, a clerk would mark the infraction. Somewhere else, a scribe would copy it neatly into a ledger destined for dust. You continue walking as dawn begins to brush the rooftops in gray and pink. The village yawns awake. Doors creak open, smoke rises, and geese march like little soldiers toward the pasture, their feet slapping in rhythm. A bell rings from the manor house, signaling that another day of feathered legality has begun. You can almost imagine the steward smiling, ink pot ready, waiting to record the first honk of the morning. And as you leave the village behind, you wonder whether those laws, so peculiar, so specific, so absurd, ever truly vanished, or if they simply hid themselves under new names, waiting for another age of paperwork and fines. The sun is up now, thin and pale, stretching over the thatched roofs like melted gold on bread. You trudge down a narrow path that smells of damp straw and roasted grain, and you can hear the low muttering of the market square beyond the hedges. There, geese are everywhere, under carts, tied to posts, even dozing near the church wall. But before you can appreciate the pastoral chaos, someone shouts, "Feather counter!" And you notice a man trudging through the crowd with a scale and an expression that suggests he's been born tired. You're about to meet the most misunderstood figure in medieval French agriculture, the feather tax collector, keeper of the plume impot. Under the feudal system, every part of a goose had value. The meat was food, the quills were writing tools, and the feathers were luxury currency. A good feather pillow could fetch nearly as much as a pig, and noble households demanded a constant supply. So the local lords, brilliant in their greed, invented the feather tax. Each peasant household had to surrender a set number of goose feathers per year, clean, dry, and unblemished. Think of it as a medieval subscription service you couldn't unsubscribe from. You watch as a woman in a patched linen gown presents a bundle of feathers to the collector. He sniffs them, yes, literally sniffs them, to check for rot. Too damp, and he'll fine her. Too light, and he'll accuse her of mixing in duck feathers. Her hands shake as she explains the geese are molting late this year, that the weather's been strange. He notes something in his parchment and moves on. You can tell she's relieved. This week, at least, her feathers have passed inspection. Historians still argue whether this tax began as a royal decree or as a local custom. You murmur to yourself, overhearing two scholars bickering in your imagination. Some claim it started in the 12th century under Philippe Auguste. Others insist it arose piecemeal, village by village, until it hardened into law. Either way, by the 1300s, goose feathers had become a kind of soft currency, traded, taxed, and occasionally stolen with the seriousness once reserved for silver. In a corner of the market, a young boy plucks loose down from a goose tied to a barrel. He gathers it into a pouch and weighs it carefully. "For the tithe," he says proudly, and you notice his pouch bears a small carved charm, a goose foot in oak. It's said that touching it before payment brings luck. Superstition meets taxation, a pairing so French it almost makes sense. A tall, elegant man in a blue jerkin passes by. You recognize the type, a steward from the manor, sent to supervise. He stops at a stall where a woman sells quills to scribes. Each one must bear the mark of the manor, he reminds her, pointing at a red wax seal. The seal, of course, proves the feathers were legally harvested and taxed. Without it, the scribe could be fined for buying contraband quills. Yes, black market pens were a thing. You catch yourself grinning. Picture a medieval police raid on a scribe's hut. Hands where we can see them, monsieur. And put down the illegal quill. Further down the square, a group of men argue under a striped canopy. One waves a parchment decree while another holds up a goose, wings flapping indignantly. The debate: should taxes apply to feathers shed naturally, or only to those plucked? The law isn't clear, and the bailiff looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. Finally, someone shouts, "Let the notary decide," and everyone groans. Medieval bureaucracy, because nothing says progress like paying 3 people to weigh a feather. You wander toward the edge of the market, where the poorer folk stand. A hunched man kneels, smoothing a goose's wing gently, his lips moving in prayer. He's not praying for forgiveness, he's praying for molting season. Without feathers, he can't pay his tax. And without payment, he risks losing grazing rights in the village marsh. You realize this system wasn't only about money, it was about control. The feather tax kept people tethered to the land, bound by plumes and parchment. A friar strolls past, sandals dusty, humming a psalm. You overhear him telling a merchant that feathers from church-owned geese are exempt. Divine geese, apparently, float above taxation. A miracle of paperwork, he chuckles. You suspect even the saints would roll their eyes. Still, not all feather law was cruel. Some towns, particularly in Gascony, had curious little loopholes. If a widow couldn't meet her feather quota, she could substitute goose songs. Yes, songs. The record states she must present herself at the Lord's Hall and sing a melody of geese in the field. Whether this was genuine charity or public humiliation is unclear, but it's undeniably poetic. Imagine taxes paid in honks. You take a moment to watch the sunlight catch on a drift of feathers swirling through the air. They rise like snowflakes, catching light, settling on cobblestones and caps. A goose somewhere squawks indignantly, as if protesting the whole ridiculous system. And you can't help thinking that in a world this strange, the birds might have been the only ones who understood the joke. The market begins to quiet as the church bell tolls. The feather collector packs his scale. A few stray quills stick to his cloak, fluttering as he walks away, a walking symbol of bureaucracy's absurd grace. Around you, the villagers exhale, their day's labor measured in ounces of fluff. As you leave the square, a breeze tugs at your sleeve. A white feather clings there, stubborn, shining in the morning light. You pluck it free and tuck it behind your ear. Maybe it's luck, or maybe it's just lint, but it feels like the world's smallest rebellion. By the time the feather tax collector's cart disappears down the hill, you've wandered toward the edge of the village, where oath turns soft and glistening. The air grows heavier, sweet with the smell of pondweed and wet rushes. This is Goose country, the marshlands. A place where the laws weren't written in parchment but carved in mud. Here, the rules are older than the church steeple, older even than the manor house on the rise. You can almost feel them under your boots, ancient agreements passed down through gossip and grudges. The village marsh rights, as they'd later be called, decided which families could graze their geese on which patches of wetland, and for how long. Step over the invisible line, and your birds could be confiscated or, worse, publicly shamed with ribbons of nettle tied around their necks. Yes, the geese got punished too. A hater trudges past you, staff over his shoulder, a string of geese trailing like obedient soldiers. His boots squelch in the muck. He nods politely but doesn't speak. Outsiders have no business in the marsh. You follow him at a distance, watching as he pauses by a stake driven into the mud. A carved goose head marks it, his family's claim. A few yards away stands another stake, painted green. That one belongs to the DuPonts. Between them runs nothing more than water and faith, and both are treacherous. You crouch, trying to imagine a world where the borders of one's livelihood shift with the tide. The hater's geese wade, dabbling in the shallows, necks bent like question marks. It looks peaceful until a flock from the next parcel drifts too close. Both herders shout, waving sticks. One hurls a clod of mud. The geese flare their wings, honking outrage. A fight breaks out. Mud, feathers, and dignity flying. It seems absurd, but these marsh disputes could end in blood. There's a 14th century record from Saintonge describing a duel between two herders over grazing rights the width of one goose's stride. The duel ended when one man fell into the mire and was swallowed by the earth. Historians still argue whether that was literal or poetic. Either way, the court ruled the survivor rightful owner. The sound of flapping fades, and quiet returns. You watch one of the men collect his birds, muttering about fines and curses. In the distance, a church bell tolls noon, though you can't see the tower through the reeds. You realize this place exists half in lore, half in legend. The marsh isn't merely land, it's reputation. A family that loses its marsh rights loses its standing, its inheritance, even its marriage prospects. There's an old superstition here. Each marsh has a guardian goose, a spirit bird that protects its rightful owners. Some swear they've seen it, a shimmering white shape that appears when strangers trespass. Others say it's just mist and imagination, but more than one traveler has claimed to hear phantom honking in empty bogs. The locals call it La Garde Blanche, the White Watcher. You can almost believe it as fog drifts low across the water, curling like smoke. You sit on a stump, watching a woman gather reeds nearby. She pauses to greet you, her accent thick and musical. "Outsider," she asks. You nod. "Then mind your steps," she warns. "These fields remember who belongs." She gestures to a cluster of cottages on slightly higher ground, her family's. Beyond them, the manor walls gleam faintly. "The Lord says all marshes belong to him," she adds with a small laugh, "but his boots never touch the mud." It's true. Feudal lords loved to claim ownership of wetlands but rarely visited them. Instead, they issued charters granting limited rights in exchange for, what else? Goose tribute. In some regions, herders had to present one goose per acre each spring as proof of loyalty. In others, the payment came in eggs or feathers. Failed to pay, and the marsh reverted to the crown. Bureaucracy seeped everywhere, even into the mud. You trail behind the woman as she gathers her bundles. "Every family marks their land differently," she explains. "We carve the poles, others tie ribbons or hang goose skulls." She says this as casually as someone discussing garden fences. Then she stops, frowning. One of her stakes has been moved, tilted inward. Her eyes narrow. "DuPonts," she mutters. "Always pushing the line." You glance toward the neighboring field. A man stands there pretending not to watch. It's a standoff, ancient as time itself. Two families, one puddle too far. "You'll bring it before the warden?" you ask. She shakes her head. "No. He charges a fee, and he hates my cousin." Then, with a shrug, the marsh decides. Meaning, floods, drought, and luck will sort it out long before the paperwork does. There's something strangely poetic about it all. These people, hemmed in by rules, still cling to nature's fairness. The marsh floods, resets, erases. Every spring, the lines blur again. You imagine them meeting at dawn, redrawing borders by consensus, arguing, laughing, swearing, until everyone's satisfied, or too tired to care. A gust of wind sweeps across the pond, sending ripples like silk. The geese quiet, heads tucked. You can almost hear the heartbeat of the place, a slow rhythm older than any charter. Somewhere in the reeds, a frog croaks, as if to close the argument. By evening, mist curls thick around your ankles. The woman heads home, bundle over her shoulder, calling her geese with soft clicks. They follow obediently, leaving tiny prints in the mud that fill with reflected sky. Behind you, the marsh whispers. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe it's that legendary white watcher keeping count of who stepped where. You take one last look at the boundary stakes, crooked silhouettes against the darkening water. In a world this full of rules, the marsh feels like rebellion, alive, shifting, and wonderfully impossible to legislate. You smile, certain that no royal decree can outsmart mud forever. By the next morning, mist still clings to the ground like wool, and you follow the faint echo of a bell toward the village square again. But this isn't market day, this is something far stranger. A crowd has gathered outside the chapel, murmuring, shuffling, clutching their cloaks against the chill. At the center stands a table draped in a faded red cloth, and upon it, yes, you blink twice, a goose. The bird looks unimpressed. Its feet are tied loosely with twine, and it glares at the priest as if personally offended by theology. You edge closer, realizing this is one of the most curious institutions of medieval justice, the animal trial. You might laugh, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, real courts convened to try animals for crimes ranging from theft to murder. Pigs, cows, rats, even beetles had their day before the bench. And in France, geese were no exception. The logic went like this: if animals could cause harm, then they were moral agents. And if they were moral agents, they could be judged. It's the sort of reasoning that only makes sense after too much communion wine. This particular goose, according to the whispers around you, stands accused of malicious trespass and destruction of grain belonging to the Lord's steward. A serious charge, especially since the steward's grain is tax grain. You find yourself wondering whether the goose has any hope of defense. A small man in an enormous black cap steps forward, the advocatus animalium, or animal advocate. Yes, that was an actual job. His duty is to defend the accused creature with all due legal argument, and he takes it seriously. He bows to the priest judge, clears his throat, and declares, "My client acts according to her nature, guided by divine instinct, not malice." The goose honks right on cue, as if agreeing. The crowd snickers. Someone mutters, "She's got a better lawyer than I ever had." The prosecution follows, represented by the steward himself, a red-faced man still covered in bits of chaff. He waves his hat dramatically. "Your Reverence, this bird has cost me 2 sacks of barley and no small humiliation. She entered my granary thrice, ignoring barriers and warnings, and defiled the sacred storehouse." You're impressed he managed defiled without irony. The priest sighs, folds his hands, and looks heavenward, perhaps praying for patience, or for this fast to end before lunch. "Does the accused deny the charges?" he asks dryly. The goose flaps her wings once, scattering feathers into the crowd. The advocate nods solemnly. "My client, as your grace can see, rejects the allegations." Historians still argue whether these trials were sincere attempts at justice or elaborate community theater, a mix of moral instruction and local entertainment. Some scholars claim they reflected genuine theology, the idea that divine order extended to all creatures. Others insist they were simply an excuse for villagers to vent frustration, to laugh at authority in safe disguise. Either way, the records are real, the verdicts recorded in the same ledgers as human crimes. A boy beside you whispers that, last winter, a rooster was excommunicated for crowing during a funeral procession. The priest said it mocked the dead, he adds, eyes wide. They buried it in the dung heap. You try not to smile. The Middle Ages had a flair for drama. Back in the square, the priest raises his hand for silence. Having heard the arguments, he says, and seeing no sign of repentance, he pauses. The goose honks indignantly again, shaking its feathers. We decree this goose shall be fined 1 bushel of grain, to be paid by her owner, and confined for 3 days to the parish pen as penance. The crowd applauds. Someone throws a crumb of bread in triumph. The advocate bows to the bird. The steward, scowling, mutters about justice and trudges off. You watch as the goose is led away, escorted like a disgraced noble. Later, you follow the procession to the pen, a small fenced enclosure near the mill. The goose stands inside, preening, looking entirely unbothered by her sentence. The children laugh, tossing her bits of straw. You suspect she'll emerge a folk hero. One elderly man leans on his cane beside you. Once, he says, they hanged a goose in Chartres. Said it bit a bishop. He chuckles. Poor bird didn't stand a chance. But the people, they remembered. Made songs about it. He hums a few bars, off-key but cheerful. You ask if he thinks it really happened. He shrugs. In France, anything can be true if it rhymes. You stroll back toward the village green, thinking about the absurd dignity of it all. Justice, pageantry, feathers, and faith, all woven together like threads in a tapestry nobody ever finished. It's ridiculous, yes, but also deeply human. A community acknowledging chaos by pretending to control it. You pass the church again as the priest sweeps feathers from the steps. He glances up, sees your curious expression, and smiles faintly. It isn't about the goose, he says. It's about the sin. Then, after a pause, though the goose does make a fine example, you leave him to his sweeping, the sound of bristles brushing stone fading behind you. The day grows warm, the air thick with the scent of grain and gossip. Somewhere nearby, the pen rattles, and a faint honk echoes like laughter. And as you follow the road out of the village, you realize this law-bound world had a strange wisdom of its own. To them, order was sacred, even if it meant giving a goose her day in court. By the following afternoon, the village hums again, this time not with courtroom drama, but with the quiet rhythm of work. You hear it long before you see it, the steady thump of wooden staves against the earth, the shuffle of bare feet, the bubbling conversation of children too young to complain yet. You crest a hill and look down upon a meadow shimmering green under the noon sun. Dozens of geese waddle there, spread across the grass like living pearls, and among them run the goose boys, tiny, wiry herders no older than 10, armed with long sticks and heroic delusions. If you've ever thought your first job was tough, imagine being responsible for 200 opinionated birds that refuse to walk in straight lines. The goose boys were the backbone of medieval rural life, though they didn't know it. Every household pooled money to hire 1 or 2 each spring, paying them in food, a wool tunic, and occasionally a single copper coin. They were the apprentices of mud and patience. You approach a group of them resting under a crooked oak, eating rye bread and laughing over a game involving pebbles and curses. One boy spots you and shouts, "Careful where you step. That one bites strangers." He points to a plump grey goose eyeing you suspiciously. You pause mid-step, unsure whether to bow or run. A smaller girl, no more than 7, whistles sharply, and the goose freezes. "They listen if you speak nicely," she says, smirking. "Mostly." You ask her how she learned that trick, and she shrugs. From my mother's mother. You have to look them in the eye. They can smell fee and bread. In many regions of France, these children held a peculiar status. Not quite servants, not quite free. The law referred to them as gardoires, literally, guardians of geese. If one of their birds was stolen or injured, they were personally fined unless they could prove the loss was beyond their vigilance. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval bailiff that your goose was taken by a fox. Or worse, by a saint. Yes, there's an old record claiming Saint Martin borrowed a goose that refused to return. No fine was issued, naturally. You follow the children as they herd the geese toward the stream. The birds waddle in neat lines, murmuring softly, like monks half asleep. One boy hums a tune to keep rhythm. They like this one, he explains. It's a simple melody, repetitive and soothing, oddly hypnotic. You wonder if the geese truly respond or if the sound just keeps the herders sane. A sudden commotion breaks the peace. A young goose breaks rank and charges into the stream, splashing wildly. The goose boys groan. That's Etienne's bird again, someone calls. The smallest boy, presumably Etienne, throws down his stick and wades after it, muttering, "You'll get me fined again." The rest cheer him on as though watching a knight in battle. He finally corrals the bird back, soaked and triumphant, though the goose seems entirely unrepentant. "Why do you keep him?" you ask. Etienne wipes his nose on his sleeve and grins. "Because he's smart. He only runs when the steward's watching." You can't help laughing. There's rebellion in that goose, rebellion the boy seems to share. Historically, the position of goose boy wasn't only practical, it was educational. Peasants believed tending animals built character, discipline, and humility. Yet village records suggest that goose herders were notorious pranksters. They tied ribbons to pigs, swapped goose eggs, and occasionally liberated birds from rival pastures. In 1359, one chronicler from Poitiers wrote of a plague of unruly children who weaponized their flocks against the bailiff's horse. You hope that's true. It's too good not to be. As you watch the children, a soft breeze carries the scent of crushed mint and wet feathers. The air hums with life. There's something comforting about the simplicity. Geese grazing, kids laughing, sunlight turning the water to liquid glass. And yet, beneath it all, the ever-present whisper of law persists. Every movement, every feather, every honk is regulated, documented, or taxed. Even the goose boys know it. One older child, with straw-colored hair and a thoughtful look, tells you that his uncle was fined last year because a goose crossed into another parish. It didn't even eat anything, he says indignantly. It just stood there. You ask how they proved it. He shrugs. The droppings. Of course. Medieval forensics. By late afternoon, the flock gathers near the hedgerow, preening and murmuring as the children count aloud. Counting is serious business. A missing goose can ruin a family. You watch them touch each bird's back gently, whispering its nickname like a prayer. Pierrot, Blanchette, Saint-Onge. Some names sound noble, others ridiculous. Why name them? You ask one girl. She tilts her head. If they have names, they come when called. Usually. It's not true, of course, but you admire the optimism. As the sun begins to dip, the goose boys drive their flock homeward, sticks tapping rhythmically on the ground. The geese move like a slow, living river, honking softly as they go. The children's laughter fades into the rustle of leaves. For a moment, the laws, the taxes, the punishments, all of it feels distant, irrelevant. There's only the rhythm of footsteps and feathers and the sweet hum of evening. At the meadow's edge, one of the boys calls out, "You should come tomorrow. We're racing them." You raise an eyebrow. Racing geese. He grins, proud as a knight. Of course. Whoever's goose runs fastest wins an egg. You wave goodbye, smiling. Behind you, the field glows in the golden light, dotted with geese settling into soft piles like fallen clouds. You can almost imagine the laws of this land being written not in ink, but in footprints and laughter. And somewhere among those muddy footprints lies the simple truth of medieval life. Everyone, even a goose boy, was bound by rules, but now and then, they found a way to make them sing. The next morning dawns with the smell of baking bread and damp earth. You follow the familiar path toward the village square, where an unusual excitement hangs in the air. A wooden sign, freshly painted, reads, "Fair day, market, judgment, and music." 3 words that summarize the entire medieval universe: trade, justice, and joy. You weave through the growing crowd. Merchants have arrived from neighboring towns, spreading out bright cloths piled high with goods. Wool, salt, onions, barrels of ale, and small bundles of dried herbs all compete for attention. A woman shouts that her goose down is the softest in all of Aquitaine. A man counters that his salt comes from the purest tears of the sea. You suspect both exaggerate. But amidst this cacophony, the real spectacle isn't the market. It's the judgment field, a raised wooden platform at the center of it all. It's where the bailiff holds open court, where villagers bring grievances and disputes to be settled before all. Today's case list, nailed to the post, includes a familiar theme, on the matter of property loss and the unruly goose of Etienne Galliard. You can't help grinning. The goose boy's trouble has escalated. You find him standing by the platform, barefoot, clutching his cap. The goose in question, an undeniably smug creature, is tethered beside him. Etienne looks mortified. The complainant, an elderly man with a grey beard and an expression like sour milk, is explaining to the bailiff that the boy's goose trampled his onion patch. The bailiff listens gravely, though you can see the hint of a smile forming beneath his beard. "And what say you, boy?" Etienne kicks at the dirt. "The goose was chasing a butterfly, sir. It didn't mean harm." The crowd chuckles. Someone calls out, "Let the goose testify." The bailiff raps his stick against the bench. "Silence," he says, though his eyes twinkle. He looks at the goose, who honks indignantly, as if in protest. Then, after a long, theatrical pause, the bailiff declares, "By the law of beasts and boys, the fault is shared. The goose is fined 1 onion." Laughter erupts. The old man sputters but can't argue against the absurd fairness of it. Etienne bows, relieved, and the goose honks again, victorious. It's a ridiculous scene, but an illuminating one. These small courts were the heart of rural justice, part theatre, part law, part community ritual. The fines were rarely about money, they were about peace. Everyone left with their pride slightly bruised but their lives unbroken. After the laughter fades, the market resumes its rhythm. You wander among stalls selling pickled vegetables, pewter cups, and trinkets of carved bone. A toothless juggler tosses apples while singing a ballad about St. Dunstan catching the devil by the nose with tongs. Children giggle, hiding behind skirts. At one end of the square, a group of monks from the nearby priory sells tiny illuminated prayer cards, miniature masterpieces painted on scraps of parchment. You pause to admire one depicting a goose beside St. Martin. The monk, seeing your interest, smiles. "A reminder," he says, "that even humble creatures can guide us to grace." You ask about the story, and he recounts it eagerly. When St. Martin tried to hide from the people who wished to make him bishop, it was a goose's loud honk that betrayed his hiding place. So, the monk concludes, the goose is both sinner and saint's herald. Perhaps that's why we eat it in his honor. You thank him, though you can't help picturing Etienne's defiant goose hiding behind an altar, honking smugly. Later, near the ale barrels, you meet the village reeve, a thin, sharp-eyed man wearing a fur-trimmed cap. He's the Lord's representative, responsible for collecting rents and enforcing feudal dues. You strike up conversation, curious about how such fares are regulated. He explains that every sale, even of a single egg, is taxed. It keeps order, he says, and fills the coffers. You glance at the bustling scene and wonder how much of this order is genuine and how much is simply tolerated chaos. The reef follows your gaze and adds, "Still, better a noisy fair than an empty one." He's right. There's life here, messy, unpredictable, joyous life. As the sun climbs high, music begins, a hurdy-gurdy's drone, a flute's bright trill, a drum's heartbeat. The rhythm spreads like warmth. People dance in circles, sleeves flying, laughter spilling into the dust. You watch a baker twirl his wife, flowers still smudged on his apron. Even the bailiff joins in, clapping to the beat. Etienne and his goose, meanwhile, parade proudly through the crowd, the bird crowned with a wreath of onion stems. You realize, watching them, that this fair is more than trade or tax, it's release. A brief suspension of the weight of rules. A day when the village remembers itself not as a collection of debts and duties, but as a living, breathing whole. When evening falls, the square transforms again. Torches flicker, shadows dance against timber walls, and the music softens to a hum. The merchants pack their wares, the last mugs of ale are drained, and the bailiff, perhaps drunker than he should be, raises his cup to the stars. "Let all debts rest till morning," he declares. Cheers answer him. You walk home along the quiet road, the scent of roasted goose lingering in the air. The laughter fades behind you, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the soft murmur of the stream. The laws of the land still exist, of course, they always will, but for one day, they've bent toward mercy. And somewhere in the dark, a boy and his goose walk side by side, both forgiven, both free, for now. By the time dawn drapes its silver veil across the fields again, the village feels different, emptier, calmer. The fae's laughter has burned away, leaving a hush that smells faintly of spilled ale and trampled grass. You wander past the churchyard, half expecting to see Etienne's goose still parading like a crowned fool. But instead, you find a new kind of solemn spectacle, the monks and their sacred geese. It begins with a distant hum, a low chant rising through the morning mist. You follow the sound, drawn like a moth to the echo of prayer. The path leads you to the abbey, a squat stone building surrounded by a moat-like ditch and an orchard where pear trees bend under their own fruit. Inside the walls, geese move in single file, serene as monks themselves. A young novice stands by the gate, herding the birds with quiet precision. "The brothers are at matins," he whispers, "and the geese, they attend too, in their way." You blink. Attend? He gestures toward the cloister garden, where the chant grows louder. Through the archway, you glimpse rows of robed monks swaying with the rhythm of psalms. And there, waddling between them, are a half-dozen geese, perfectly calm, perfectly synchronized, as if they too are praying. You suppress a laugh. But no one else seems to find this odd. In fact, the prior, a round, kindly man with spectacles and a voice like honey, spots you and smiles. "Ah, a visitor. You've arrived on St. Martin's Vigil. Our geese are most devout today." You bow politely, pretending you've planned this pilgrimage all along. The prior invites you to walk with him through the abbey's small courtyard. Everywhere, geese wander freely, honking softly, nibbling at stray crumbs of bread, occasionally splashing in the stone troughs. "We keep them for feathers and for festival," he explains, "but they are also symbols of vigilance. The Romans revered them, you know, for warning of danger on the Capitoline hill." You nod, remembering some half-forgotten lesson. Historians still argue, he adds, whether medieval monks truly believed these birds were sacred or simply found them too clever to waste. He pauses beside a carving in the cloister wall, a relief of an angel holding a goose. The bird's neck is elongated, its wings stylized into curls of stone. To us, the prior murmurs, the goose reminds that even humble creatures can speak truth. Remember St. Martin's tale? How he hid from his calling, and the geese betrayed him with their noise. You smile. So, betrayal became holiness. Precisely, he says, eyes twinkling. Divine irony. In the refectory, the air smells of herbs and wax. A scribe sits at a long table copying a manuscript by candlelight. You glance at the open page, gold leaf initials, fine black lettering, and in the margin, a tiny illustration of a goose in a halo. Brother Allard's doing, says the prior. He paints each bird differently, one for each of God's moods. You notice one goose has its beak open mid-honk, another stands over a fallen apple, and another seems to be wearing spectacles? You stifle a laugh. The prior leads you to the abbey's back courtyard, where a pond glimmers like dull pewter. A handful of geese float there, feathers puffed against the cold. Every abbey has its own rules, he explains. Our order forbids the sale of blessed feathers. But the Cistercians down the road? They trade them for ink money. He sighs, half disapproving, half envious. It's not hard to imagine the petty feuds that erupt between holy men over geese. You picture two abbots arguing over who has divine claim to a particularly fertile gaggle. And, indeed, the prior confirms it. Last winter, a dispute arose over breeding rights. We settled it with a psalm off. They sang Psalm 91, we counted with Psalm 100. The Lord, I think, sided with us. You bite your tongue before suggesting the Lord probably just wanted peace and quiet. Still, the blend of faith and feather fascinates you. These monks have transformed simple animals into living metaphors for vigilance, humility, and grace. Yet, they also depend on them for mundane tasks, cleaning grain stores, guarding gardens from pests, providing quills for writing. One brother tells you proudly that he's trained a goose to honk whenever strangers approach the gate, as reliable as any dog, but holier. By midday, the abbey bell tolls for the meal. You're invited to join the brothers for a modest feast. Bread, cheese, onions, and, somewhat awkwardly, roast goose. You glance at your host, uncertain, but he waves off your hesitation. We eat not in cruelty, he assures you, but in gratitude. Each life returns to the divine. You chew quietly, trying not to make eye contact with the geese pecking crumbs at the threshold. Afterward, in the garden, a few monks pluck feathers from dried bundles, bundling them neatly for quills. The prior picks up one and hands it to you. For writing your own laws, he says. Every pilgrim should have one. The feather is pale gray, soft, and oddly dignified. You tuck it behind your ear, and the prior smiles as though he's anointed you with wisdom. As you leave the abbey, you glance back at the cloister. The chanting resumes, slow and resonant, echoing through the stone halls. A flock of geese circles overhead, their wings slicing the sky in a perfect V. For a moment, the sound of their honks melds with the hymn, and you can't tell where prayer ends and instinct begins. You walk down the road, feather in hand, realizing that in medieval France, holiness didn't separate itself neatly from absurdity, it waddled alongside it. Faith, after all, could live in both relics and ridiculous birds. And though you're no monk, you whisper a quiet thanks to the geese of St. Martin's Abbey, for reminding you that devotion sometimes wears feathers and honks at inconvenient hours. By the time you leave the abbey and wander back into the open countryside, the air feels lighter, sweeter somehow. You pass wheat fields and vineyards just beginning to turn gold under the late autumn sun. And as the path winds toward another small village, you hear laughter, music, and the unmistakable sound of honking, again. But this time, it's not monks or market traders. It's a wedding. The entire hamlet seems to be in motion. Ribbons tied to doorposts, garlands of ivy looped between windows, and children scattering petals and goose feathers through the square. At the center, a bride and groom stand hand in hand, blushing under the gaze of half the parish. And right beside them, trussed up like a prize knight in white cloth and gilt thread, is a goose. You blink. You're not imagining it. "Ah," says a woman balancing a jug of wine. "You've come for the goose decree, haven't you?" She grins and presses a cup into your hand before explaining, "No marriage in this parish is valid until the goose gives its blessing." You raise an eyebrow, and she laughs. It's the law, or it was. Old Count Raymond's code from the 12th century. Every union must gift the manor a goose, and one must be carried in the procession for luck. You take a sip of wine that could double as paint remover and glance at the poor bird. It looks both bewildered and strangely proud, as though it knows it holds the fate of two souls in its webbed feet. As the ceremony begins, the priest drones through the Latin vows, and at the final amen, he nods toward the goose. The groom lifts it high, and the crowd erupts in cheers. The bird honks 3 times, clear, echoing, perfect. The people clap, declaring the marriage blessed and lawful. Apparently, that was the test. You lean toward an older man beside you, who's already wiping tears of laughter. "And if the goose doesn't honk?" you ask. He sighs dramatically. "Then the marriage must wait until it does. Sometimes hours. Once, 2 days." You can't help but imagine the poor couple staring anxiously at a silent goose, wondering if divine approval might require grain, patience, or bribery. This odd ritual, you soon learn, wasn't mere superstition. It was rooted in feudal taxation and fertility symbolism. In medieval France, geese were associated with abundance, especially female fertility. Laws across regions like Auvergne and Limousin required newlyweds to offer 1 goose to their lord, not just as payment but as a charm for prosperity. Some even demanded the delivery of eggs from the same goose the following spring as proof of fruitfulness. The custom blurred lines between sacred and secular. Church records mention priests arguing over who had rightful claim to the marriage goose, the lord or the clergy. One manuscript from 1273 even records a bishop decreeing that no goose may be sacrificed in union without the priest's first blessing. Historians still argue whether this was a spiritual concern or merely an attempt to redirect goose profits toward the church coffers. As the wedding feast begins, long tables stretch across the square. Platters of bread, cheese, roasted nuts, and honeyed wine fill every inch. And of course, at the center of each table, goose. Stewed, roasted, smoked, even stuffed with apples and herbs. The air smells rich and savory, a perfume of joy and grease. You sit beside a group of old women shelling walnuts. One of them, eyes sharp as a hawk's, tells you about the law of the bride's feather. According to her, every new wife must pluck a feather from the wedding goose and tuck it beneath her pillow on the wedding night. For fertility, she says. And dreams. She pauses, though sometimes just sneezing. Another woman adds that the feathers were often kept for years, sewn into small sachets as good luck charms. You glance around and notice some guests wearing tiny feather brooches, tokens of affection and proof of community ties. The jokes, of course, flow as freely as the wine. Better a goose that honks, one farmer declares, than a husband who doesn't. Everyone laughs, including the bride's mother. Even the priest smiles, though he pretends to be scandalized. As night falls, torches are lit, and music fills the square, pipes, fiddles, and the deep rhythm of hand drums. The newlyweds dance, the goose waddles awkwardly in circles, and the entire village joins in. You find yourself swaying too, your feet tracing patterns in the dust. But beneath the laughter lies something older and stranger. Watching these people, you realize the goose is more than a mascot. It's a relic of a time when law, faith, and life were all tangled together, when a bird could be currency, blessing, and symbol all at once. You remember the abbey's prior saying that divine irony rules the world. Perhaps this is proof. Humanity, so proud of its laws and logic, still bows to the whims of a creature with feathers. As the celebration winds down, the groom walks the goose to the manor house to present it as tax payment. The steward accepts the bird solemnly, marking the name of the couple in his ledger. Then, in a gesture both bureaucratic and oddly touching, he plucks a single feather and hands it back. "Your first return," he says. The bride takes it gently, tucking it into her hair. The night ends with quiet singing. The last torches sputter, the musicians pack away their instruments, and somewhere behind the manor, the goose settles in a straw pen, dreaming its own strange dreams. You walk away down the lane, full of food and the faintest melancholy. The stars glimmer like distant candles. You think about how many lives these peculiar laws have touched, how many marriages began, or perhaps failed, at the whim of a honking bird. And you can't help but wonder, as the echo of celebration fades behind you, whether love in medieval France was truly between two souls, or three, counting the goose. The next morning, you wake to the faint echo of bells, the kind that mean a market's begun, or maybe a pilgrimage is passing through. You stretch, shake the straw from your cloak, and wander down the dusty road. Sure enough, you soon find yourself among travelers, merchants with carts, barefoot friars humming psalms, and peasants leading flocks of geese that waddle obediently in perfect rows. The sight is almost hypnotic, so many pale, plump bodies gliding through the dust like little clouds with feet. Each bird wears a colored cord around its leg and, you notice, a small scrap of parchment tied to the cord like a tag. Curious, you stop one of the travelers, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice roughened by wind and laughter. "Goose passports," she explains matter-of-factly. "Issued by the bailiff of St. Antonin. Without them, would be fined or worse." You blink. "Passports? For geese?" She holds one up for you to see. The parchment bears an ink stamp and a few lines of crooked Latin. 10 lawful geese, belonging to Perrine of Rouergue, bound for the pilgrimage road to Rocamadour, under no suspicion of theft or plague. You can't help but grin. The medieval world really could make bureaucracy out of anything. Apparently, stolen geese were such a problem that entire networks of goose inspectors emerged along pilgrimage routes. They checked the birds' feet for dye marks or brands, verified ownership papers, and occasionally confiscated flocks thought to carry disease. Some lords lost fortunes, Perrine tells you, when their branded birds turned up in another man's marsh. She lowers her voice. "And if you didn't have papers? They'd seize your birds, sometimes you too. Claim you'd been trafficking sacred beasts." "Sacred," you echo. "Oh yes. Pilgrims used geese as living offerings, messengers to the saints. Especially Saint Martin and Saint James. Some say the birds were believed to carry prayers faster than men could walk." You glance at her geese. One tilts its head as if listening, eyes bright with suspicion. Maybe there's a bit of divinity in that gaze after all. As you walk alongside her, the road twists upward through vineyards and chestnut groves. Dust clings to your boots. From ahead, you hear snatches of chant, a small group of friars escorting their own gaggle, each goose adorned with a colored ribbon. They march in solemn rhythm, though one goose keeps breaking formation to nibble at grass. "A novice," one friar sighs. By noon, you stop at a roadside inn, a wooden sign swinging overhead, the Pilgrim's Wing. The yard is full of flocks resting in makeshift pens, their owners eating stew and mending harnesses. You notice a clerk sitting at a table with ink, quills, and a heavy ledger. Travelers line up before him to have their documents examined. You step closer. Each Goose passport is read aloud, compared against a tally, then marked with a wax seal. Verification of lawful passage. The clerk mutters in a nasal tone, stamping another parchment. 1 copper coin per bird. You whisper to Perrine, "Do they ever actually read what's written?" She smirks. "Only if your goose looks suspicious." You both laugh quietly as a merchant argues about an extra toll for excess honking. The clerk insists the noise disturbs the sanctity of the road. Then find the saints. The merchant growls, tossing his coins down. The absurdity of it all feels like theater, and yet it's very real. Laws about animal movement were crucial to prevent theft and disease, especially after waves of livestock plagues in the 13th century. A single infected flock could wipe out a village's food supply. So, the goose passport became both a legal document and a charm of safety. Over your bowl of stew, you overhear tales of a legendary flock that once made the pilgrimage to Compostela entirely on foot, without losing a single bird. The monks at Santiago supposedly recorded it as a miracle. Historians still argue whether the story was propaganda to boost local goose trade or genuine marvel. As dusk approaches, the road quiets. The pilgrims light campfires along the ditches, their geese settling in tight clusters, feathers glowing orange in the firelight. Perrine tends her flock with gentle hands, murmuring to them in a sing-song voice. "You treat them like children," you say. "They are," she replies simply. "They feed us, guide us, keep us warm. I've seen a goose wake a man just before a bandit struck." She strokes one bird's head fondly. "If I die on the road, I'd want my flock to carry my soul." The thought lingers in the air between you, half whimsical, half holy. The geese, oblivious, murmur softly to one another, a kind of sleepy gossip that drifts into the night. Later, lying beneath a sky spangled with stars, you hear the faint shuffle of feathers and the creak of distant carts. The air smells of smoke and grain and something ancient, like the shared heartbeat of travelers who've crossed the same road for centuries. You realize you've stumbled into one of those rare medieval spaces where practicality and mysticism coexist perfectly. Somewhere between prayer and paperwork, the goose has become both commodity and companion, both object and omen. And tomorrow, hundreds more will march along this road, passports tied to their legs, honking their legal status into the dawn. You close your eyes, smiling. In a world that can make bureaucracy out of birds, perhaps miracles aren't so far-fetched after all. The following night, clouds roll in low and heavy, swallowing the moon whole. The road that had been sunlit and safe now feels wild and conspiratorial. You walk along the edge of a marsh, the reeds whispering like gossipers, the mud sucking greedily at your boots. Somewhere nearby, faint honking echoes, slow, careful, and forbidden. You pause. Out of the mist, a lantern flickers, then another. Figures move in silence, bent low, herding shapes you recognize instantly. Geese. Dozens of them. Their white feathers glow faintly in the dark like ghosts on parade. You duck behind a willow and watch. The herders, 2 men and a woman, speak in whispers. The woman lifts her lantern to reveal a bundle of grain. "Quiet now," she murmurs. "They'll hear us from the watchtower." You realize with a small thrill, you've stumbled upon night herders, the outlaws of the goose trade. In medieval France, many parishes forbade grazing after sunset. It was a practical law, meant to prevent crop theft and poaching. But it also allowed local lords to control the feeding cycle, and therefore the wealth, of anyone who kept geese. Breaking it could mean heavy fines, confiscation, or even exile. Yet here they are, wading knee-deep through the marsh, breaking the rule with practiced ease. The geese move like ripples, trained to silence. You decide to follow, curiosity outweighing common sense. One of the men notices you but doesn't shout. He gestures for you to come closer. When you do, he grins through his beard. "You're no reeve," he says quietly. "Keep low, stranger." His name is Gervais, and he explains as you walk. "The frost came early this year. Our birds need feeding, or they'll die. The Lord says no grazing till the solstice. But the Lord doesn't feed us when the grain's gone, does he?" You shake your head. He tosses a handful of seed into the reeds, and the geese converge soundlessly. "We've done this every winter," he continues. "Sometimes the watchmen look away. Sometimes not." From across the marsh, a faint metallic sound breaks the stillness, a bell ringing once, twice. Gervais freezes. "Patrol," he whispers. The other herders extinguish their lanterns, plunging you into pitch blackness. The only sounds now are breath, wind, and the faint rustle of feathers. You crouch beside him, heart racing, as the distant crunch of boots on frost draws closer. The patrolmen are laughing softly, maybe drunk. One carries a torch. Its glow sweeps across the reeds like a lazy searchlight. For a long moment, the light hangs near your hiding spot. The geese stay perfectly still. Not a honk. Not a shuffle. Then the patrol moves on, the sound fading into the dark. When you finally exhale, Gervais chuckles under his breath. "Smarter than half the men I know," he mutters, patting the nearest goose. Once the danger passes, you help scatter the last of the grain. The birds feed greedily, their beaks clicking softly in the night air. Gervais' wife, a woman with hands rough from work and eyes bright with mischief, smiles. "They eat fast," she says. "They know what it costs to eat free." She offers you a piece of dried apple, and as you chew, you find yourself wondering how many such secret feedings happen across France each winter, small rebellions against hunger and control. Historians still argue whether these night graziers were desperate peasants or defiant smugglers. Perhaps both. You help them pack up as the first hint of dawn tints the horizon gray. The geese, full and content, settle into a quiet huddle. Gervais raises his lantern again and whispers a kind of benediction. "Sleep, little tax evaders." You can't help laughing softly. Before you part ways, he hands you a single feather tied with a red thread. "For luck," he says. "And silence." You tuck it into your belt. By the time the sun finally breaks through the fog, the marsh looks ordinary again, innocent, lawful. Only the faint footprints in the mud tell a different story. The patrol returns later that day, inspecting the fields, finding nothing amiss. The reeve writes in his ledger that no suspicious herding was observed. You smile to yourself. That night, back in the inn at St. Antonin, you tell the innkeeper what you saw. He leans in close, eyes gleaming. "Oh, everyone knows about the moon herders," he whispers. "They've been doing it for generations. There's even a proverb, where the goose grazes after dark, justice sleeps." You sip your ale thoughtfully. It tastes faintly of rebellion. Out the window, the marsh glows faintly silver again, and you imagine Gervais' family already at work, silent, tireless, unrecorded. In their quiet defiance lies something oddly noble, a law broken not from greed but from survival. You remember the monks' geese, their chants, their careful order. And now, here in the mud and mist, you see the opposite, chaos with purpose, faith without scripture. Both, somehow, part of the same strange world of feathers and fines. As sleep pulls at you, you think, perhaps freedom, like a goose, isn't meant to be kept penned for long. Morning returns like a guilty secret. You wake in the cramped-in room to the low groaning of wood beams and the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from downstairs. Outside, St. Antonin hums with cautious energy, merchants setting up stalls, a priest scolding an apprentice, a goose somewhere honking its descent. When you step into the street, the air feels sharpened, alert. You quickly realize why. At the edge of the square stands a small stage, freshly built, and beside it, a cluster of officials in fur-trimmed robes. On a pole above them flutters a banner bearing the sigil of the crown, the 3 lilies of France. The bailiff, a man with a chin like a shovel, clears his throat and announces to the gathered villagers, by decree of His Majesty's court, all herding of geese without written license shall henceforth be punished by fine or forfeiture. A groan ripples through the crowd. Someone mutters, "So now we must pay to feed our own birds." You catch sight of Gervais near the back, hat pulled low. His jaw is set. The bailiff continues, "Furthermore, any person found conducting night grazing will be brought before the Lord's steward for sentencing. No exceptions, no appeals." He snaps the scroll closed for effect, clearly enjoying himself. The villagers disperse slowly, murmuring. The law isn't new, exactly. It's an old rule being enforced with new vigor. But to them, it feels like a fresh wound. You walk beside Gervais and his wife. "They mean business now," she says quietly. "Last winter, it was a warning. This winter, it'll be chains." You ask if anyone will resist. Gervais shrugs. "You can't fight parchment with pitchforks," he says. "But parchment burns all the same." That evening, you find the tavern louder than usual. Every table hums with the same story: the bailiff's pompous speech, the steward's new taxes, the whispers of a coming crackdown. Somewhere near the fire, an old man plucks a lute and sings a satirical tune about the Duke of Ducks and Count of Quacks. Everyone laughs, though nervously. Over mugs of ale, the talk grows bolder. A mason suggests refusing the license fees outright. A baker proposes hiding geese in churchyards, where tacksmen fear to tread. A shepherd jokes about disguising his flock as swans. The jokes are masks, but beneath them, something real begins to stir, a collective unease. Later, you notice a small group slip quietly out the tavern's back door. Curiosity tugs at you again, so you follow. They head toward the granary, lanterns low. When you arrive, you find Gervais among them. He looks at you, half amused, half resigned. You really can't help yourself, can you? They are planning, it turns out, a small rebellion, not with swords, but with loopholes. "If the crown wants licenses," says one, "then let's give them licenses." He unrolls a sheet of parchment, ink already drying on it. It bears an elaborate seal, handmade, fake, but convincing. Historians still argue, you'll later recall, whether peasant forgery was a form of protest or simply survival. Tonight, it feels like both. The group plans to circulate these counterfeit permits among nearby villages. Enough to confuse the officials, to buy time until winter passes. You help grind the red wax for the next seal, the scent sharp and smoky. Funny, isn't it? Gervais muses. They make laws to keep us honest, and we learn to lie just to live. By midnight, the granary is full of laughter, the quiet, nervous kind that feels half like prayer. Someone pours wine. Someone else stamps another parchment with the makeshift seal, muttering, "By authority of Saint Goose, may your grazing be blessed." You can't help laughing. The humor masks the risk. If caught, forgery means prison, or worse. But in this dim light, courage feels contagious. You even draft one permit yourself, signing it with absurd flourish, approved by the royal keeper of honking affairs. When dawn finally comes, the conspirators scatter, clutching their false licenses like talismans. The following week, the bailiff rides through again, demanding to see papers. To his irritation, nearly every header presents one, neatly written, sealed, official-looking. He squints, suspicious, but dares not challenge them all. Bureaucracy, after all, runs on the illusion of order. A rumor spreads that even the steward himself received a counterfeit by mistake. The story grows funnier with each telling. The steward, proudly displaying his forged license to the Lord, insisting it was genuine. You find yourself grinning as you walk along the fields. The geese graze peacefully again, unaware of the invisible war of ink and parchment waged in their name. Still, there's tension in the air. The authorities will catch on eventually. You can feel it in the way Gervais' wife double bolts their door now, or how conversations hush when the reeve passes by. That night, you dream of scrolls multiplying endlessly, geese stamping them with muddy feet, the wax seals melting into puddles of red. When you wake, the rooster hasn't crowed yet, and the world feels balanced on a knife's edge, between laughter and punishment, order and absurdity. And you think, for a creature that can't read, the goose has inspired a library's worth of laws, lies, and legends. You wake the next day to a sky the color of pewter and a sound that is half music, half alarm, a trumpet echoing from the castle hill. Below it, the town stares like a nest of disturbed hens. From every window, faces peer out. The bailiff's voice follows, harsh and clipped. By order of the steward, all herding licenses are to be re-examined. Any found false will be punished. You sigh. Bureaucracy has caught up at last. The square is already crowded when you arrive. Peasants stand in line, clutching their precious parchments as if they were holy relics. Gervais and his wife are there, too, eyes tired, lips pressed tight. They're checking the seals, she whispers. They've brought a clerk from Toulouse to read the handwriting. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, sits behind a table like a judge at a carnival. He holds up each document, squints, then either nods or shakes his head. A nod means relief. A shake means ruin. When one poor fellow's seal cracks to reveal candle wax instead of true vermilion, the crowd gasps. 2 guards step forward and drag him away. Forgery, the bailiff declares. Punishable by confinement and forfeiture of stock. The man shouts his innocence, but the geese he brought to town scatter, honking wildly through the crowd like an orchestra of panic. You dodge one that nearly topples your boots, and for a fleeting second you imagine the scene as a miniature painting. Gilded chaos, feathers flying, parchment torn mid-air. Historians still argue whether such trials were genuine legal procedures or theatrical displays meant to frighten the masses. Standing here, you'd bet on the latter. When Gervais' turn comes, your heart beats faster than it should. The clerk unfolds his paper, inspects the seal, and raises an eyebrow. Curious, he mutters. This signature reads Royal Keeper of Honking Affairs. For one awful moment, silence hangs like fog. Then the clerk snorts. A joke, is it? Gervais bows slightly. A tribute, my lord. We meant no disrespect. The crowd laughs nervously. The bailiff glares but hesitates. The room teeters between anger and absurdity. The clerk, perhaps mercifully, rolls up the parchment and waves them on. Just go, he sighs. And keep your birds quiet. You exhale in relief. Later, Gervais slaps you on the shoulder. That was your handwriting, wasn't it? You admit it. He laughs so hard he nearly drops the feed sack he's carrying. Then you, my friend, are officially the savior of Saint Antonin's geese. You'll be a legend before Lent. That evening, celebration bubbles under the surface. No one dares call it that, but you can feel it, In the extra ladle of stew, the songs hummed under breath, the soft rhythm of geese settling safely by the riverbank. Still, the fear lingers. The arrested herders remain in the steward's custody, and rumors swirl about confiscated flocks and burned fields. The air tastes of smoke and superstition. You walk out past the town walls to clear your head. There, in the twilight, you find a lone goose wandering near the ditch. It wears a scrap of ribbon around one leg, a mark used by the prisoners to identify their birds. You kneel, stroke its feathers, and it eyes you with that familiar blend of arrogance and curiosity. You think of Gervais' words, "They know what it costs to eat free." You guide the goose back toward the marsh. It follows willingly, steps careful on the frozen ground. When you reach the water's edge, you whisper, "Go on." It hesitates, then slides into the dark, rippling surface, gone, but not forgotten. By the time you return to town, the bells are ringing again. The steward has issued a new decree. Confiscated geese will be auctioned to pay the cost of inspection and enforcement. In other words, the crown will sell back what it has stolen. At the tavern, tempers flare. "They'll take until there's nothing left," someone shouts. "Then they'll tax the feathers on our pillows." Another slams his mug. "Then maybe it's time to fight." You sip your ale quietly. Revolt never begins with swords. It begins with exhaustion, sharpened by laughter that stopped being funny. A few brave souls plan to free the confiscated birds before the auction. Gervais calls it madness, but his wife only shrugs. Madness is what's left when obedience fails. You don't say yes, but you don't say no either. That night, under a moon as pale as parchment, you find yourself creeping once more toward the steward's yard. Crates line the walls, filled with restless geese. The guards at the gate are dozing. The plan is simple: unlatch, scatter, vanish. The first crate opens easily. Geese burst out, flapping like storm clouds, honking their freedom song. One strikes you in the face with a wing. Another knocks over a lantern. Flames lick at the straw. For a terrifying second, it seems the whole rebellion will end in ashes. But the fire fizzles against the damp earth, leaving only smoke and the chaotic triumph of liberated birds. By dawn, Saint Antonin awakens to a miracle, or a mess, depending on who's speaking. Geese everywhere, on rooftops, in the churchyard, strutting through the bakery like noblemen. The bailiff, red-faced, declares it an act of mass sedition. The villagers, pretending innocence, simply shrug and chase the birds home. You grin, watching one particularly stubborn goose perch atop the steward's carriage and refuse to move. Even law, it seems, must make room for feathers. By midday, the town of Saint Antonin has transformed into something between a carnival and a battlefield. Geese roam freely through the streets, pecking at spilled grain, honking at merchants, even waddling into the church as if seeking sanctuary. Bells ring not for prayer, but in exasperation. The steward himself arrives from the castle, robes askew, face flushed. "Round them up," he shouts, pointing wildly. Guards scramble after the birds, slipping in mud, tripping over baskets. One goose bites a soldier's glove clean off, another steals a child's loaf of bread. It's chaos, glorious, ungovernable chaos. You stand at the edge of the square, trying, and failing, not to laugh. Gervais joins you, eyes shining. "They can't catch freedom with a broom," he mutters. He's right. The more the guards chase, the wilder the geese become, scattering into alleys and rooftops, each honk echoing like mockery. The steward finally throws up his hands. "Fine. Let the cursed birds have their way," he bellows. By nightfall, the rebellion has already taken on mythic form. People tell it differently depending on whom you ask. Some say the geese were guided by saints, others that witches whispered spells into their feathers. Children sing a rhyme about the night of the flying flock, complete with flapping arm gestures. Historians still argue whether this small act of mischief inspired later peasant uprisings, but you can feel something shifting. The fear that once ruled the town has cracked, and through the crack seeps laughter, stubborn and bright. You follow Gervais home that evening. His wife meets you at the door, flowers still on her hands. "We heard the steward fell into the river," she says. Gervais grins. He should have bought a license before swimming. You all laugh until your ribs ache. Later, you sit by the fire, the air thick with wood smoke and roast onions. The warmth seeps into your bones. You realize that for all its absurdity, today has been a kind of victory. No proclamations, no swords, no martyrs, just feathers and courage and the quiet refusal to obey nonsense. Outside, the geese are settling, their honks fading into sleepy murmurs. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster crows prematurely, confused by all the commotion. Gervais pokes at the embers. "You know," he says thoughtfully, "they'll come again. Maybe next week, maybe next season. They'll tighten the laws, send more men, make examples of us." You nod. "And you'll keep herding anyway." He smiles without looking up. "We'll keep living. Same thing." A long pause follows. The only sound is the gentle hiss of fire and the rustle of straw in the rafters. You think about all the strange rules that have shaped this countryside, how even something as simple as goose herding has been twisted into a labyrinth of taxes, licenses, and threats. Yet every time the law grows more absurd, the people answer with wit instead of war. Maybe that's what survival looks like, not obedience, not defiance, but endurance wrapped in laughter. When you finally step outside, the moon has risen high and full, casting silver light across the fields. A few geese glide along the river like phantom ships. One turns its head, watching you with that same impossible intelligence you've come to respect. "You won," you whisper. It honks once, short, defiant, final, and paddles away. As you walk back toward the village, you pass a wall covered in new graffiti, a crude drawing of a goose wearing a crown, wings spread, captioned Vive la Libra. Long live the free goose. You grin in the dark. Back at the inn, travelers are already telling the tale. They say the birds planned it, one insists. Marched out in perfect formation. Another laughs. No, no, the peasants trained them with secret whistles. You sit quietly by the fire, listening. The story grows taller with each retelling. In one version, you're a knight disguised as a herder. In another, you're a spy for the crown who switched sides for love of freedom, or of foul. You say nothing to correct them. Stories have their own laws, after all. Before heading to bed, the innkeeper offers you a final cup of cider. Strange world, he muses. All this noise over a few geese. You smile, swirling the cup. Not strange, you say softly. Just very, very human. The innkeeper nods slowly, eyes distant. Then may the humans win, at least once in a while. You drink to that. The cider burns sweet and sharp, like rebellion in liquid form. Upstairs, as you lie on the straw mattress, the wind hums through the shutters. You can still hear the faint, contented honks outside, a lullaby of victory. The thought makes you smile as your eyes drift closed. In dreams, you see parchment turning into feathers, laws unraveling into laughter, and 1,000 white wings lifting above the grey rooftops of St. Antonin, glinting gold in the morning light. By morning, the chaos has settled into legend. The steward's men have long since given up their chase, and St. Antonin smells faintly of victory, stale grain, trampled mud, and the unmistakable musk of goose feathers. The streets are quieter now, but they hum with that rare, invisible electricity that follows rebellion. You walk through the market square, and the changes are small but unmistakable. A woman selling onions hums a tune about the night the geese flew free. A boy has carved tiny wooden geese and sells them for a coin apiece, calling them lucky charms against stupid laws. Even the church bell seems to ring with a smug rhythm, as if it, too, is in on the joke. Still, not everyone laughs. The steward, humiliated, has sent for reinforcements, a royal scribe and 2 soldiers, to restore lawful order. Their arrival is imminent, and you can feel the tension creeping back in like cold mist. You find Gervais down by the riverbank, mending a fence. He glances up, squinting. "They're coming, aren't they?" You nod. He drives a stake into the soil with deliberate calm. "Let them come. The geese will behave better than they ever did." He smirks. "At least until someone looks away." It's a fragile peace, half defiance, half exhaustion. The villagers know they can't win an open fight. But they also know something deeper now. The law can be mocked, and laughter can wound more sharply than steel. When the royal party finally arrives, the villagers gather again in the square. The scribe dismounts, adjusting his velvet hat and frowning as though the countryside itself offends him. "This town," he begins, "stands accused of unlawful herding, property damage, and obstruction of crown business." You can almost hear the collective eye roll. The steward gestures angrily toward the fields. "The birds ran amok, sire. The peasants refused my orders." The scribe, unimpressed, flips through his scrolls. "And how many birds were recovered?" The steward hesitates. "Ah, none." A pause. The scribe looks up, deadpan. "Then there are no birds to prove your claim." The villagers stifle laughter. You bite your lip to avoid joining them. The steward flushes crimson, sputtering protests about witnesses and feathers and divine chaos. The scribe sighs. "Saint Antonin," he declares finally, "will pay a modest fine for negligence. Then this matter is closed." Gervais leans toward you and whispers, "Negligence. That's fancy talk for we got away with it." The villagers cheer, softly at first, then louder. Even the geese, hidden somewhere beyond the walls, seem to answer with triumphant honks. As the royal party departs, the scribe's assistant lingers behind, a young woman with ink-stained hands and curious eyes. She approaches you quietly. "You were there, weren't you?" You feign ignorance. She smiles knowingly. "Don't worry. My uncle herds ducks in Limoges. The laws are just as ridiculous there." She hands you a folded scrap of parchment before riding off. When you open it later, you find a simple sketch of a goose wearing a crown, and beneath it, the words, "Every law needs wings." You tuck it into your coat. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of life resumes. Winter loosens its grip. The river thaws. The geese return to the meadows, strutting as if they own the place, which, in a sense, they do. The taxes remain, the edicts pile up, but enforcement grows lax. Perhaps the steward fears another embarrassment. Perhaps even he, secretly, admires the nerve of it all. You spend your days wandering the countryside, watching herders at work. You learn the subtle whistles used to guide a flock, the hand signs, the strange bond between human and bird. You even try it once, badly, and end up being chased by an especially moody gander who refuses to respect your authority. Gervais laughs until he nearly falls over. One evening, as you share bread and cider by his fire, you ask what he'll tell his children about all this. He pauses, thinking. "I'll tell them the truth," he says finally. "That the law was foolish, and the geese were wiser." He takes a slow sip. "And maybe," he adds with a grin, that the clever stranger who showed up one winter helped us teach the steward a lesson. You raise your cup in mock protest. I'm just the narrator, you say. Exactly, he replies. And every story needs one. Outside, a soft rain begins to fall, tapping against the thatch roof. The sound blends with the distant murmurs of geese bedding down for the night, a lullaby of stubbornness and survival. Historians still argue whether that winter marked the end of France's most absurd agricultural restrictions or merely a pause in them. But for Saint Antonin, it was enough. The people remembered. The geese endured. The laws lost their bite. You fall quiet, staring into the fire. The logs crackle softly, sending up curls of smoke that twist like ink strokes across the air. It occurs to you that every civilization builds walls, and every living thing eventually finds a way through them, sometimes on wings, sometimes on laughter. Outside, a lone goose honks once, sharp and sure, as if to punctuate the thought. The thaw comes at last, slow and forgiving. The river, once sealed in glassy silence, now babbles with melting ice. Saint Antonin smells of wet earth, hay, and faint goose droppings, the aroma of victory, if there ever was one. You walk the muddy path past the mill, where the wheel creaks back to life, and for the first time in months, you see children herding goslings along the lane. The tiny birds totter uncertainly after their keepers, their soft down catching the sunlight like stray bits of gold. The sight warms you. It feels like a small, humble miracle. In the square, the steward's notice board stands bare. The last proclamation, a half-torn warning about grazing permits, flutters weakly in the wind, its seal faded and meaningless. Gervais tears it down with a grin and uses it to light his pipe. If the king wants to find me, he says, he can follow the feathers. You join him on a bench, sharing a moment of silence that feels like exhale after a long-held breath. Around you, life resumes its quiet rhythm, a smith hammering, a dog barking, a goose somewhere honking at nothing at all. The rebellion, such as it was, has left no bodies, no heroes, no songs, only laughter, whispered stories, and the faint smell of singed straw. And yet, it has changed everything. The people of Saint Antonin carry themselves differently now, shoulders back, chins high, as if they've discovered that obedience is optional when absurdity reigns. You wander through the fields one last time before leaving. The meadows are alive with motion, geese grazing lazily, their reflections trembling in puddles of melted snow. The sound is soft, content, utterly unremarkable, and that's what makes it perfect. A farmer waves to you from across the ditch, calling, "Heading off, traveler." You nod. "Then may your road be free of tolls," he says with a grin. "And your bed free of feathers." You laugh, promising nothing. As the path climbs toward the hill, you glance back at the village, the crooked rooftops, the curling chimney smoke, the faint gleam of the river. It all seems smaller now, and yet somehow grander for what it has endured. Historians will argue for centuries over the details, whether there truly was a night of flying flocks, whether the forged licenses existed, whether the steward's tumble into the river was accident or design. But what matters more is that the story survives it all. Because it does. By the time you reach the next town, the tale has already traveled faster than you. You hear it from a peddler selling trinkets, how, in Saint Antonin, the peasants trained their geese to rebel. He swears the birds spelled words in the sky, that one even bit a tax collector on the nose. You don't correct him. Myths need no editing. You stay at a small roadside inn that night. Over supper, the innkeeper chuckles. "I heard the crown's thinking of banning geese entirely after that business." Then he lowers his voice conspiratorially. "Good luck enforcing that." You smile. Indeed. Later, alone in your room, you unroll the parchment the young scribe's assistant gave you. the crowned goose sketch and the words, "Every law needs wings." You pin it near the window, and when the wind stirs the curtain, it almost looks alive. Outside, the first stars appear, cold and clear above the dark hills. Somewhere, you imagine Gervais and his wife sitting by the hearth, the geese murmuring softly outside their door. Maybe he's telling the story again, exaggerating the parts with your help, laughing at how the world nearly lost its mind over a few stubborn birds. And you, well, you've walked through enough history tonight to know that peace is rarely grand. It's found in the quiet after the noise, the field after the law has passed, the honk after the decree. You close your eyes and breathe it in, the faint scent of earth, parchment, and freedom. As the fires burn low and the night folds its wings around you, the tale of Saint Antonin's geese drifts to its soft conclusion. The laws of men, no matter how pompous, always meet their match in the persistence of life, whether feathered or human. You picture it now, a soft dawn rolling over wet grass, the air thick with the gentle rustle of grazing birds, the distant clink of a pail, the slow hum of a world rebuilding itself in laughter. The steward sleeps in his manor, dreaming of order. The peasants sleep in their cottages, dreaming of fields without fear. And somewhere, under a wide French sky, the geese sleep too, fat, content, triumphant in their oblivion. Their feathers rise and fall with each breath, like parchment unrolling, like the rhythm of a promise kept. You've walked beside them through absurdity and defiance, through mud and moonlight, through the strange poetry of rules no one quite believed in. And maybe now, as the night deepens, you understand a quiet truth. Every age invents its nonsense, and every heart finds its way around it. So, let your mind drift with those ghostly white wings. Let the sound of distant honks fade into the hum of crickets, the sigh of wind across meadow grass. The story, like the season, has softened. And somewhere between laughter and sleep, remember this: no law lasts forever, but courage, even the small kind, does. Good night, wanderer. May your dreams be full of fields, and may the geese never stop grazing.